I think we are waiting for. I think we are waiting for just one person to join from Gav. Everyone's here.
Okay, everyone's here. And the opposition?
The opposition is here.
All right. Just Kishore, once when you said like your voice was echoing, so could you once check that?
Yeah, we checked that. That's not going to be an issue.
All right. Seeing that both the teams are here, government and opposition, welcome everyone to the grand final of Parlance 2024. On our proposition, we have NUJSA. Many congratulations to you on proceeding to the finals. And on opposition, we have BITS Goa, Goan Taxi Mafia in opposition. Again, big congratulations to you guys as well. Hi, I'm the chair of this round, and my name is Joy Banerjee. My pronouns are he and him, and all the best to the team. I would like my panel to also introduce themselves. Thank you.
Hello everybody, Shravani here. I'll be a panelist for your round. All the very best.
Hello everyone, I'm Jikisha, pronounced she, her. All the best.
Hi everyone, this is Garima. I'll be the panelist for this round. All the best.
Hi Tejas, congratulations for reaching the final. Good luck to everyone.
Thank you. And with that, I would like to call the Prime Minister to open the debate. Here. Oh, before I commence ahead, the motion for this round is this House believes it is in the interest of mainstream feminist organizations to denounce feminist vigilante groups in developing nations. With that, I would like to call upon the Prime Minister. Here.
Can I just get 20 seconds to set up my own timer?
Sure.
Yeah. Just 1 second. Sorry about that. Yeah. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Imagine yourself as a woman who's a mother of 2, who's been facing verbal abuse for many years now. And the way that patriarchy works, you don't really understand every time that your husband probably hits you or is rude to you or treats you in a demeaning manner, that this is something that you're not supposed to go through. And this is very common. But it is also likely that human is unlikely to voice it out too much and definitely not go to to get as much help as you want. That is the kind of debate that we are dealing with today, and we want to make we are the side that actually benefits these vulnerable women the most. What is our context in terms of this vigilante movement actually look like, right? A couple of things. Firstly, we think it looks like direct action groups, these groups like the Gulabi Gang takes, so which means that without any negotiation, without any investigation as such, immediately showing up to houses anonymously with masks on their face, with lathis, etc., to hit the man who's violence, but also it looks like providing inconsistent help in an ad hoc manner, right? Because you can't go to every house, you can't figure out which house where domestic violence or harassment or things like this is happening, given that it is very hard to understand that. We think that they're usually outside the legal system, work on fringes, and do not provide that kind of consistent help that these women require. But secondly, in terms of the interests of the mainstream feminist movement, right, what does this look like? A couple of things here. A, but they care about the feminist movement as a whole, which means that it is about the collective change that can happen as opposed to just localized differences that they can bring. But also, it's not just about beating men, but bringing about larger systemic changes, right? And for this, they require specific things like political capital that is required for them to get the kind of support in order for them to actually be able to bring change in the future. Lastly, in terms of a comparative, we think that we support this sort of denunciation, but the opposition has to tell us why the feminist movement is actively going to support it, right? They are going to probably endorse it. They can't coexist on a narrative where, these vigilante groups also exist. That is just simply untrue and is very, very uncharitable, because as long as they exist, it is going to be seen as something that the movement by default does associate with and does endorse. Two arguments then from proposition. Firstly, on why the safety of women in general gets better on our side, but secondly, why the interests of the movement in the long term is also better on our side. On the first argument, then, why is it that safety for women in general or women interests is something that we provide much better? There is a crucial problem here, that the backlash that happens because of this vigilante movement getting the kind of legitimization that the feminist movement can provide outside the legal scope is immense and very, very damaging. What does this mean? Three things. Firstly, in terms of crackdown, right, the fact that the disproportionality in terms of just violence means that it justifies that as a group, when you come and threaten these men, they can equally form these groups as well and threaten you back, but also resort to violence in a justified manner. But it also crucially justifies this idea of violence in general, which means that as a man, when you're resorting to violence, there is an easy tit for tat narrative that exists, which means it's very, very hard to actually convince people that they are the ones who resorted to violence first, or whether or not that is true. But secondly, and most importantly, they dissociate people who need female fraternities the most, because understand, things like domestic violence are very, very hard to talk about. They're very, very sensitive issues, which means that A, women are already scared, so they do not really go to things like the police in the first place. But B, the husbands and family structures in a way that it exists right now, the only way they can get help is to tell their friends and find comfort and community in that sense, right? What does this mean? The only way they can get some sort of mental sanity is when they talk to someone, their friend group, or just people around them who've been through something very, very similar, and find comfort there, but also recognize these are the only people who can give them that sort of comfort to how to deal with it, or give them proper advice when it's coming from older people in these fraternities as well, but also the only people who can convince them how possibly they can move out of these systems. Their backs and turn into these vigilante groups. It's not just that, given that these are anonymous actions, it's the risk and the suspicion is so high that men are likely to restrict the mobility that women have towards other women just accessing this community in the first place. But even if that is not true, we think, given that these are developing countries and patriarchy is so entrenched and it's also internalized by these women, it's very likely that they are not going to take this risk themselves, right? Because as a mother who cares about her children's life and not breaking apart the family, who's living in this proper family structure where there are hierarchy of powers, we think women do not want to be seen as someone who's breaking their families, would probably want to keep giving it another try, and are less likely to reach out to other women in the first place, which is incredibly damaging given that these are the most vulnerable people in this debate, right? But thirdly, I'll take that POI later, that the direct action that happens in terms of just the actions that are taken by these vigilante groups gives men the opportunity to play the victim card in the most easiest manner, right? What this means is men are the ones who can mobilize power in the easiest manner. It's easy for them to say, look, they resorted to, given that this kind of direct action is more visceral instead of actually getting law enforcement, right? So not only the men rights movement, but also law enforcement against the feminist movement on their side. Before I move on, yes, that POI.
The feminist movement, an opinion on everything. There's no reason why we need to actively support these things and our interest to denounce.
No, that is simply untrue, because if this is working parallel equality, but on the same parallel, these women who care about other women's interests are doing this thing, it is associated with the feminist movement regardless. Come and defend that in your next speech, right? But moving on to as to why we operate better in these systems, we think that they hold more, like, why is it that we actually solve this problem when we denounce this, right? They hold more legitimacy in these areas if they do not resort to violence, meaning that they aren't shunned away from important services like these mainstream women can provide them, right? Mainstream feminist organizations prevention services, hotlines, safe shelters, etc. All of which we still get access to on our side, something that will legitimately be taken away on theirs. But on to the second argument then, as to in terms of long-term change and better interests of the movement in general, right? We think that mainstream feminist organizations have more political and economic capital on our side. Why? Firstly, because in developing countries, for any change to happen, you necessarily need to convince the moderates. It's never the extremes that are going to work on either side. If not, you make it worse for women on yours. But it's these moderates who need to be brought on our side. And they have an inherent attachment to things like law and order. They do not support things like mob violence. So denouncing these vigilante groups is just better in terms of getting that sort of change. This doesn't happen on their side because conservatives will take this in any way to bring it against women to sort of remove the change that we already have. They need to come and defend this better. They can't say that they can co-opt both of this on their paradigm. So proud to stand in prop.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that fine speech, calling upon the leader of the case. Here.
15 seconds. Right. Am I clearly audible? Can you?
Yeah, you're clearly audible.
Manit going hello, note of speech. With that, starting in. Okay, first and foremost, from the very get-go, I would like to clarify what the burden is on opposition here. There is absolutely no obligation for a major feminist organization to have an opinion on anything and everything. We don't need to actively defend the existence or support these organizations, but simply not denounce them. With this first piece of characterization here, what actually care about? They care about improving the quality of life of women everywhere. Secondly, they care about improving the perception of women in society and the self-perception of women. Second piece of characterization: what are the sorts of places in which these vigilante groups operate? We are operating in actual villages where there is an extreme lack of public law enforcement. These are not places with moderate swing voters. These are extremely conservative areas where even the internet is marginal. Now that this framing is very clear. These areas have very poor rights for women. They have barely any access to education. These women have no careers. They have no financial freedom. With this, moving on to our first push, I will prove to you why this organization is likely to have some checks and balances and operate responsibly and not rashly. 4 pieces of mechanization here. First and foremost, they depend on the support of the local people because the local people are the ones that give the vigilante group their legitimacy in the first place. Without these local people, these organizations don't function. Then because they need the support, they have to act in a moderate manner. Second piece of mechanization. They want to have more recruitment in the future for their own organization. These organizations want to continue functioning in these areas till the conditions in these areas improve systematically in the future, meaning they don't want to alienate people by acting too rashly. Third piece of mechanization, they want to avoid explicit crackdowns from whatever level of local law enforcement does exist in those areas, and this will become relevant later on in my speech as well. The fourth and last piece of mechanization, a lack of resources. These organizations simply don't have the resources, the weaponry, the phones and internet, which will be required to organize a mass and violent uprising, meaning that actions are going to be limited and to the extent that they're going to be moderate and not extreme. Therefore, these organizations only target the most egregious infringements of women's rights because their operations are dependent on them being able to maintain good optics, which becomes very, very critical. This means that it is unlikely that they're going to straight up go and beat up men all the time. It is far more likely that they'll do something like paint graffiti, support victims, and provide basic needs and education. Next, I'm going to prove to you why these vigilante organizations are so critical and important in these areas. Again, 4 pieces of mechanization. First and foremost, the principle of retribution. The info slide explicitly mentions that these organizations or these vigilante groups fill a crucial gap in the justice system. This means that they're a crucial means of fulfilling the principle of retribution, which would otherwise go unchecked in a lot of these areas. A lot of victims are now going to get closure because of the actions of these vigilantes. You get a lot of validation when a vigilante comes in and tells you that the abuse you faced was very wrong and supports you then and there. A second piece of mechanization, the principle of deterrence. It makes it the actions of these organizations make it less likely that men engage in violence against women, which is extremely common in places like India and Mexico. In these areas, domestic violence is very rampant, and the fear of getting publicly shamed or getting action taken against you, or say having graffiti on your wall, is going to lead to a lot of public shame, which is going to tie into the severe patriarchy which exists in these areas. Men are going to feel a lot of shame, and because of this, because of all of these deterrence incentives, there is just not going to be as much time in these areas. Third piece of mechanization: women's perception of themselves. These organizations make women feel more confident in expressing themselves and feeling that they can also be successful and break the shackles of patriarchy. In developing countries where men are typically seen as being violent and dominant, and women see themselves as having no option but to accept this. By seeing other women take up more vigilante roles, the women gain confidence in themselves. Last piece of recognition: society's perception of women. Due to these vigilante movements, society in general views women as being strong, who are capable of having their own views and opinions and actually getting shit done. This challenges conservative opinions of women, like viewing them as being childbirthing factories, and makes people more open to the idea of women having their own rights. This then directly translates to lesser sexual harassment and lesser domestic abuse for women, as the men believe that they have someone to be accountable to. Before I move on, PY, quickly.
If these are not extreme actions but just painting graffitis, how will it stop domestic violence when men can just deny these as allegations?
I have given you structural reasons as to why the principle of deterrence and the principle of deterrence is going to be such a strong factor in actually preventing men from doing things. These men care a lot about their perception. These men care a lot about how they look. A man in one of these countries doesn't want to be seen as inferior to all of the women there. They don't want to be seen as someone whose house was painted graffiti on. The sole factor of shame alone is going to be such a strong deterring factor that men reduce this. Furthermore, when the women that they're actually going to be abusing have a support structure, they once again feel empowered to actually raise their own voice against these men. Meaning, once more, another deterrence factor which is only furthering my case so far. Next, I am going to prove to you why this denouncement from a large mainstream feminist organization is likely to be the death knell for all of these feminist vigilantes. Three pieces of mechanization here. First and foremost, governments will want to crack down on the vigilante groups. Why is this so? Developing countries depend on the West for a lot of things, such as trade, security, a lot of development programs. So when a mainstream feminist movement from one of these developed Western countries denounces an organization feminist, the native governments who are otherwise inactive get a strong vigilante group. If a large if this large influence these supposedly positive feminist movements as being rowdy and not aligned with the feminist agenda, this causes severely poor on global stage. As a result, they are now forced to quell these movements because the other aid which is received from these other countries is far greater in scale and far more critical for the growth of this developing country, which needs this aid desperately. Second piece of mechanization: a loss of credibility and bad local optics. What are the reasons for these? Because of a lot of backlash from government institutions, law enforcement, the people in these areas lose their confidence in the movement. Because the local people are not very educated and not aware of, say, global situations, because when living in remote areas, they themselves don't understand why this movement is so important. And because of all this backlash from other institutions, they're going to stop supporting it. What happens then? Even if these vigilantes want to help, because of this bad optics and because of this lack of confidence, they are no longer able to, because the people they're trying to help are no longer going to support, are no longer going to accept the support that they were trying to give. They're just going to be anti-movement. Last piece of organization: the movement losing confidence in itself. In the if the mature, developed feminist movement of the West does not approve of the movement, the women who took it upon themselves to make this change are going to second guess themselves. They are no longer sure of whether what they are doing is right. They're going to lose that will to help in the same way, because of the credibility of the feminist movement and a very strong, credible organization now saying that they are what they were doing goes against the feminist agenda. Meaning, these women lose that will to help in the first place. I have then proven to you why this organization is likely to have some checks and balances, why the vigilante organizations are so critical, and why denouncement from these large mainstream organizations is going to be so terrible for these feminist vigilantes, thereby taking Gov completely out of this case. With that, I'd like to end my speech.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for that fine speech calling upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hey, am I audible?
Yeah.
My internet is a little shaky. If I have, thanks, Agil. If I've ever Like, let me know. I'll restart or something. All right. Before I begin, Karan to be in the Parlance final, so this tournament's been really kind to us. So big shout out to the tournament once again. And huge shout out to the NUJS DevSoc, everybody, and hope we keep it going. And lastly, to my wonderful teammates for coming with this tournament with me. Hopefully, this goes well. That said, I'll start my speech in three, two, and one. Some pieces rebuttal. Secondly, why do men retaliate worse and they leave no room for negotiation on their side? Secondly, and thirdly, on why on long-term feminist movement loses its legitimacy and therefore any scope of change overall, apart from these areas they function in, right? So let's talk about some key areas of rebuttal first. Firstly, on that idea that, hey, feminist movements on our side can exist separately and work independently, like parallelly with these movements anyway, right? They can't do that for three reasons, which I already told you about. Firstly, that if you're a broad movement and there's an obvious feminist movement which is now just adopting a different means to the same ends that both of you want, that means that you obviously associate that movement with a broader feminist movement and mainstream feminist movement because they are still called fucking feminist vigilante movements, which means any degree of credibility that you have for one moment will necessarily transfer to the other, and the discredit will also transfer to the other, right? This is what the premise of their final argument is when they talk about how governments will crack down and the movement will, like the main movement will seen as illegitimate. They conceded that then and there, right? But secondly, this is just very lazy, soft debating. If you want to have the cake and eat it too, bite the bullet somewhere. You can't co-opt both benefits in this debate, so they need to make a trade-off. If that's what the debate is, then the motion can't happen. Then that's just unfair debating. But secondly, let's get into more substantive things. They tell us that, oh, these movements look like ones which are very resource constrained. They want to maintain their objects. Therefore, they do things like awareness a lot more than just going ahead and beating people up. Firstly, brother, read the info slide. It talks about Gulabi Gang. What does Gulabi Gang do most of the time? It shows up to people's house in mass will show up to people's house. It is reported like hearsay instance, by the way, of like any domestic violence or sexual assault and beat the men up. That's facts. Don't lie about facts. But secondly, like why do we logically think these movements aren't the way they portray? One, they're localized, which means that they have enough resources to deal with like violence in these areas in the way they're possible. They aren't a movement because they're localized. They also aren't a movement that care about large-scale optics in the very first place, which means they can take the worst measures which go unaccounted for and they're completely fine with it. Third, these methods aren't capital intensive. Like just going ahead with a microphone or just painting graffitis on wall, beating people up doesn't take away much capital from you, especially when your political capital is least of your worries in the very first place. Thirdly, if the movement is as soft as they claim it is on their side of the house, then where's the fucking deterrence coming from, right? Just painting graffitis and doing awareness is exactly what they say will not bring any change on our side of the house, right? Which means there's little to no empowerment to these women face on their side, because if that's what they're doing, as they say, law enforcement will crack down and shoot them away. Therefore, they lose the weight and depth of the movement if it's as soft as they claim to be on their side of the house. Please pick a lane and start debating. Let's move on to this couple of more important responses that they have, right? Firstly, that they tell us that women get closure and they therefore become more confident with these movement. Two reasons why that doesn't happen. One, we are talking about the interest of a feminist movement. Interest of a feminist movement has always been victim-centric. This isn't a victim-centric thing for you to do where someone else without asking, especially in sensitive cases of domestic violence, where there are different sides of the story, where there are familial and matrimonial disputes involved, like child custody and so on and so forth, where deep intrinsic issues lie, the victim's wishes should always prevail. On their side of the house, the Gulabi movement decides what's important for the victim. This is not something the feminist movement should share for, and that's not the closure that women want. Two, closure never comes on their side of the house because the woman is never let by society to be happy in the fact that she's a cause like a husband is in hospital with broken bones, or the fact that men are hated widely in the society that they reside, right? This means that throughout her whole life, her and her children have to live with this fact, like hear it from society time and time again, hear it from law enforcement who now refuse to file complaints on their side of the house. That's not the kind of closure, and you in fact you make victimhood worse for the women. women on their side of the net negative. Lastly, on some atrocious claim that governments will crack down. Exactly, brother. When governments will crack down on these movements, what's the point of the fucking movement on your side of the house? This doesn't discredit the feminist movement. Very simple logical parallel. If Tarang is my friend, Tarang goes beats someone up, and I'm actively endorsing Tarang at that point of the house, then I'm also calling into question as to Ganesh, you have bad friends with you, right? That's simple logic. If I'm denouncing Tarang as a friend and ask him to fuck off, then my association with him was also lies there. Now I can in fact, have the opportunity to rally against bad people like Tarang in the world, right? It's basic logic. Secondly, I think even if then on their side legitimacy worsens, the government crackdown on these law enforcement crackdown on Gulabi Gang and these areas, right? Legitimacy in long term you get when government's also on your side of the house, because government action speaks your legitimacy to a wider section of people who aren't in close proximity with the crime. They only look at what law enforcement does, what court does, and they think that to be legitimate, right? Secondly, it's harder for you to now garner political capital like Tarang and Aishi tell. Legislature filled with men when you've already beaten up people and cracked down on someone. Now, they're not listening to parliamentarians sitting and talking about why they need to sentence security for women in these areas, right? No one's listening to that. Happening also diminishes if it's already less on our side of the house. Done. We want to actual argumentation. Why do we think men retaliate before that POI? Why do men retaliate worse on their side of the house? Why does it give? I think, firstly, men in general are shielded by not which is the fact that they need to be tough and they're said to be tough, and people always side with them because their side of the story is more palatable and socially acceptable. Given this fact, on their side house, when violence against me means retaliation, because they not only need to justify the masculinity that they have within them, but also need to justify to their family as to what their actions were and what the justification in addition to the domestic violences they already committed, right? So on their side of the house, you hand men on silver platter two things: A, the legitimacy to attack their wife behavior, and B, protection from rest of society, which shields them abuse as well. Fuck law enforcement for a second. On our side, law enforcement doesn't work, women still get abused. On their side, let's look at what the comparative necessarily means. This means that women is shunned and ostracized from society by any means, which means little freedom that she had in her home, right? To do basic things, go out for shopping, to without getting judged by people on the street. If it's a closely tightened community, sending her daughter to school, so on and so forth, she loses little thing that she could already do. And further, the second impact of this, the feminist movement loses its legitimacy to do set up helplines for victims of domestic abuse, direct resources, macrofinance, basic resources such as education of female children and so on and so forth. These things which have some degree of acceptance pose a lot of organic change in society in these areas, right? They lose their legitimacy too because you now are associated with the movement which did the harm that you can't quite forget for the rest of your life. On the other side of the house, never let them speak for the let the motion stand.
Thank you, Deep, for the fine speech. On the DLO to continue the ops case. Here.
Yes, 30 seconds. Okay, POI on the 5th minute, Parlance there. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, start. Panel, understand firstly that I do not engage with our mechanisms on how there are some checks and balances on these vigilante organizations too. One gives you three very clear checks and balances, right? Firstly, they still need recruitment, for which they still need some legitimacy from the local people, and also they like simply do not have the capacity to go out and like have like large mass scale shootings or like beating up lots of men and stuff like that. Note that as an average voter, how many times had you heard of of Gulabi Gang before this, right? This is because these movements are these vigilante organizations are very restricted to the small village which they operate in. They operate at very low scales because women do not have the resources to be operating in like very large numbers, operating in like very large scale and like beating everyone up. This means that they're very likely to be operating at like a scale where like they're painting graffiti a lot of times, or like at some point they go ahead and like beat a man up. But like this makes the news, and this means that the deterrence is actually working out. Also note that we don't actually need to go to a very high level to deter these men from like domestic abuse, because the men who engage in abuse have very fragile egos, which like they have already pointed out. Men want to appear strong. Men do not want to be shown as people who have been beaten up by a woman and stuff like that. Which means that if there's like a chance of this happening, men are very likely to be careful about this because they want to be protecting their reputation. These villages are places where are like very social in nature. You want to be having a high reputation amongst your friends. You want the social credit and stuff like that, which means that you want to be protecting your reputation. And to do that, Gulabi Gang coming in like beating you up means that there's a very strong fear for you to like just go ahead and not do any abuse, just to go for you to go ahead and be very careful with what you're doing, which means that we have a sufficient level of deterrence. But also note that one man getting beaten up even a little bit or shamed even once deters every single other man in the village who now thinks twice before like doing anything else or engaging in any form of abuse. Where abuse is very likely to go down because of the existence of Gulabi Gang. Also note that there is no tension in our case because the checks and balances we push are to the extent that these women don't take up arms and start mass shootings. Not that they don't do like any radical actions ever, or like they don't do any graffiti at all, or like but this graffiti just like stops being effective. Also they do not engage with like any other stuff which we will tell you, right, about the women's perception of themselves. When they see like Gulabi Gang going out, they're more likely to go ahead and voice their own opinions. They're more likely to think that they are strong and they can do this stuff themselves. Although the societal perception of women changes because now due to these vigilante movements, society generally views women as strong people who can go ahead and do stuff. This means that the folk stories which are being told to children change, the stories which are like permeating these villages change, what like comic books are coming through change. A lot of this is influenced by the societal perception of women. Gulabi Gang is exclusively able to do this because they're operating in these places where like women and where women are being oppressed so heavily, and no other law enforcement exists, no other like very strong feminist media actually exists. So why this denouncement actually going to be bad? Note that like money gives you very clear mechanization, right? A lot of governments are like very dependent on these Western organizations. And like when a large feminist organization denounces these movements internally, then these governments, even though they were inactive earlier, are likely to become active and crack down on this just for the optics and stuff like that. These organizations were fulfilling very crucial principles of retribution, principles of deterrence, are now likely to go down. These vigilante organizations going down means that the perception of women also changes, and there's a lot of internal tension within the feminist movement now, because the feminist movement has to go ahead and contend with the existence of all these things. Note that insofar as these things were always operating on a village level, the large feminist mainstream organizations never had to go ahead and comment on this or do anything, because no one was talking about this at length. You as an average reasonable voter can tell this because you had literally never heard of Las Femicidas before this, right? This is like a very minute thing which only happens in villages, and large mainstream organizations can remain completely unaffected by this, which is why we also do not need to actively support them, because no one is talking about this outside of these villages. Now, coming specifically to like the framing on these villages, note that like domestic abuse is very rampant, which means that whichever side is able to reduce domestic abuse is the side that wins the debate. Note that there are lots of impacts on women because of this domestic abuse, right? This like reduces their self-esteem to a large extent. When you're being domestically abused, you like accept your position and you're far less likely to be able to enjoy any other things. Even if you do other things or like are happy eating food or like taking care of your children, you're far less likely to have the self-esteem required to be able to enjoy these things, because abuse takes such a mental toll on you, because it affects how you think of yourself in the first place. Which means that if you're able to reduce abuse, we are far more likely to be able to get independence for women. Their only like engagement with this is that men will restrict women further to prevent them from becoming vigilantes. But firstly, note that not every woman is becoming vigilante. We just need a few in the village to become, which is why every man is not having this fear in the first place. But also there is no reason why men are actually having the capacity to restrict the movement of women so much. Because note that going out and fetching water is just something that is required for the functioning of the house. Dropping your children off to school or like getting groceries, there are things that are required of the woman to do for the function of the house. There's no reason why men can like crack down on this so hard that they simply don't have the capacity for this. But also we contest this completely because women are far more like thinking that they're capable of being outward and like going ahead and doing all these things and like having some negotiating power with like men in the family. Even Gulabi Gang exists because of the way it affects society, because when they look at art, they feel more empowered, they feel like they can actually do things, they feel like they have role models which they can look up to. Gulabi Gang, there's a lot of deterrence on abuse, which means that women have a lot more self-confidence moving. PY, before I move on.
If men was that scared of deterrence, why would legal recourse? Why doesn't legal recourse actually work, right? Why won't they just start?
Thank you. Cutting you off. There recourse in this places. This is why the Gulabi Gang came up in the first place, right? I have no clue what the POI is even based on. Like, if there was law enforcement, these things were not. On a gap we filled, as the last time the infocide literally says, these things are filling in a gap. These things are, and for these vigilante groups are literally enforcing the principle of retribution and literally ensuring the principle. Going on, they say that these groups operate largely on hearsay. We give you very strong checks and balances on these vigilante groups, which is they cannot operate on hearsay. If they beat up one man wrongly, then their entire reputation goes down. It means that recruitment for them is very difficult in later stages, which means that locals are less likely to give them shelter and support. It means that there's very, very less. They become a lot more likely to get crackdowns from the central government and stuff like that. Which means that operating on hearsay is something they just cannot do. They have to be extremely careful with the men they target. They have to be extremely careful with the art. Very strong, which means that these organizations are largely going to be very, very accountable, largely going, and they're mostly going to be going for moderate actions, which do influence society to a large extent, and it among men about abuse, but do not actually go ahead and make men fear the Gulabi haven't done anything wrong. Now, moving on, they say that the victim does not make a choice for the season. But the principle of autonomy just does not apply here, because the Gulabi Gang is made up of women who understand what you're wanting, and men are suppressing your desires anyways, which means that the Gulabi Gang is far more representative of what you want as a woman, is far more likely to be able to go ahead and get that for you than you yourself are in the absence of the Gulabi Gang. That the existence of Gulabi Gang enables you to go ahead and opt into this principle of autonomy far better. They say that women are now worse off because they can't go for basic things like shopping and stuff. They've never proven why men are able to restrict the basic functions of the house, but also they never prove you why this denouncement from the feminist movement is what causes this. So I have no reason to buy this to restrict the movement of women are going to do so regardless, right? Because they're motivated by vitriol and the patriarchal norms. There's no reason why the Gulabi Gang's existence and the specific denouncement coming from mainstream is what this at all. Thank you.
Thank you, DLO, for that fine speech, calling upon the government whip to conclude the government's case. Here.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible. Can you just read a sentence?
Yeah, hi, this is Tarang.
Yeah.
I'll be going as government whip. Okay. I hope I'm audible then. Thank you. All right. Beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, please note at the very start of this debate that they have to engage with what we told you on political and economic capital being generated on the paradigm of the government, with which there has been no engagement whatsoever, except a cursory response where they say that moderates don't exist in rural areas where these vigilante groups are actually taking their actions, right? This is a stupid argument to make because news exists in the world today. Electronic means of communication exists in the world today, which means that the actions of vigilante groups in rural areas, in the fringes of a developing nation, also influences the views of moderates in cities, the views of moderate politicians in parliaments, in governments all across the country. So you can't just squirrel away from the fact that you still have to convince moderate voters to be able to bring about any significant long-term change. We also told you that why this is important is because the feminist movement needs in these countries a long-term time horizon. You need to change laws. You need to operate 24/7 crisis centers and helplines. You need to provide legal support throughout the year. You need to organize protests. You need to make representations in parliament. You need to fight publicity campaigns, all of which require political and economic capital, all of which can only come when you convince the moderates and prevent conservative attacks that paint you as violent anarchists who beat up poor men in rural areas, right? All of this is not going to happen, and all of this has not been engaged with at all. And by PM, it's too late. So please let us have these impacts exclusively on our side, because there has been simply no engagement from theirs, right? Secondly, though, coming now to what they said about where women are actually helped better, they tell you that first by their own admission, right? And we told you this at PM. Ayushi said that these groups have limited resources agreed to by the LO, and as a consequence of these limited resources, all you can do is provide inconsistent justice on an ad hoc basis. If the vigilante group feels that a particular instance of harassment is too much, only then will they go ahead and perform anything resembling justice, right? Which means that the delivery of justice is inconsistent at best. And this is by their own admission. They have told you that only egregious instances of harassment or of discrimination or of violence will be addressed. So at best, the benefit they can claim is inconsistent and ad hoc justice dispensation. But secondly, though, they tell you that there are enough checks and balances on vigilante groups. This is insane. They are talking about the existence of moderate vigilante groups. They have, for the first time in history, created a moderate vigilante group, which is a contradiction in terms, which is extremely uncharitable debating, and which doesn't make sense. However, still engaging with them on their we tell you that the women who join these vigilante groups do not care about society at all. They're literally women who are forming a mob in a patriarchal society. I think they're beyond giving a shit about what that society cares about them. They don't give a shit. Okay, so it's these checks. Women who are already outliers, who are already at the brink of solution by the society that has victimized them so hard. That and even admitting the checks and balances might work, why these checks and balances will not completely neutralize these vigilante groups. Why is it not a possibility that these vigilante extent where nothing happens, because there's always going to be backlash, there's always going to be a risk, always going to be risk of law enforcement actually cracking down on you. So women in vigilante groups who are already at the brink of society things suddenly care about these checks and balances based on popular perception. And why these vigilante groups will not be neutralized so as to make all your impacts which you are deriving from these vigilante groups redundant, right? Next, coming now to deterrence. They tell you that shame is going to be a deterrence. No, not right now. Shame is going to be a deterrence. Please, are you aware of what works in a society which thinks that domestic violence is wrong, which actually believes that women's rights are okay and good? In a rural society, these are not popular views. In no case can you claim that rural society actually ostracizes patriarchal men. Society in this context is inherently patriarchal. What these men are doing is not an outlier. It's not something that will cause them to be shamed in their own communities, because patriarchy is the law of the land. So it's not something that you can say that men will be shamed from, because for shame to exist, popular perception must say that domestic violence is bad. And if popular perception already says domestic violence is bad, why are we even having this debate in the first place, right? But they also say that other men will somehow now be deterred from domestic violence. This is not how it works. At the same time, other men will also be concerned that their patriarchal way of beating their wives, of treating women in an inferior fashion, will get called out, which means there is an equal likelihood of these men actually radicalizing themselves against the feminist movement, of forming vigilante gangs of their own to counter and to protect themselves. They haven't given you any likelihood analysis on why one is more likely than the other. So this impact simply cannot stand, panel. You must wash it out. Second, they had absolutely no response whatsoever to our arguments about women. Ayushi told you that when the husbands of women are about vigilante action, right? These women will not report this violence in the first first place because their husbands can just as easily beat them up once these vigilante groups have gone away. How many times are you going to keep going to be able to protect these women in a long-term way to prevent any threats of crackdowns from local gangs that form? You don't have any social capital. You have limited time on coming to these houses again and again and again. The opposition's case has been absolutely hollow. They give you the benefit of inconsistent harm women because they don't have the capacity to again at the cost of destroying political capital, therefore also long run. That is not a trade-off you should be willing to make. Panel, please give the debate to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Government Whip, for that fine speech calling upon the opposition. Here.
Yeah, just give me 30 seconds. Okay. Panel, am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, cool. Let me set a timer for myself and then I'll begin. Just a second. Meanwhile, POI preferences, I'll be taking a POI close to the 6 minute. Just raise your hand or put it in chat and I'll get you if I want to. All right. I'll be starting in the reverse countdown of 3, 2, 1, start. Panel op takes this debate cleanly, and let me show you why, right? Understand, panel, that on Gov's side, if you denounce the Gulabi Gang, then the Gulabi Gang will die out and there will be a hole that will never be fulfilled, which means that, like, understand, panel, that like, Gov never really engages with what happens when this Gulabi Gang dies out, right? Okay. Now, let me just like start with a few rebuttals here and let me just like completely take out Gov's case. Fine. So, okay, they talk about like, if justice if provided at op is inconsistent, right? Because of like, whatever mechanism they talk about of having like low resources and all that stuff. Even if I take Gov's best case and concede this, which I don't, women still get benefited on our side, and on your side, all these women get repeatedly abused and have absolutely nobody to help them out. Understand, panel, that even if I get this small benefit of helping some women out over time, that is still much, much more than what Gov gives you in this case. Okay. And in this case, I already take the debate, but like, let me just go on and show you why we take this debate more cleanly, right? Okay. They just come in and state that vigilante groups will not have checks and balances, right? Note, panel, that this is a complete assertion on their side, and they don't engage in the mechanizations of why these checks and balances exist. So let me reiterate this and take out this assertion by Gov completely with our 3 cases of mechanization, right? So, the case of mechanization are like, are just like pushed out by like Manit and Vagat as well, and show you exactly why these vigilante groups have these checks and balances in the first place. Okay, cool. Now, they talk about how votes of moderates matter a lot, right? Okay, there exist other far more proximate and far more critical issues in developing nations such as corruption, economic slowdown, immigration, etc., which means that even these very few moderates who live in first-tier cities have much bigger fish to fry than the Gulabi Gang. So I have like absolutely no reason why like they care about this in the first place, right? And understand, panel, when Gov comes in and talks about stuff like, oh, like the Western feminist movement will have to either like associate with these feminist movements or like completely denounce from it, which is completely is wrong, because I understand, like, as an average international voter, average intelligent voter, panel, how many times have you heard of the freaking Gulabi Gang, right? Absolutely none. Which means, panel, like, like on op, when we come in and say that, we can like just like co-op this and like not associate with the feminist movement, that is completely valid, and all the points that stay with it are complete fall through as well, right? Okay, now women get seen as like violent anarchists. That's what is pushed by Gov here, right? Let me take this out as well. This is unlikely because the normal view of women is that they are weak. Complete directly challenges this stereotype which already exists, which means that like now women stuff like that, which directly impacts abuse as well, and which means that abuse is much more unlikely on our side. And form their own vigilante group. 3 pieces of organization take this out, right? And don't have the time to be doing this sort of vigilantism in the first place. Then want to be calling out and crying foul about vigilante groups of women because that makes them look weak, and they can't let them agile, equal, and want to appear strong, and all these like feminist values, right? All then, even if we cede both of these first 2 points, men simply lack the structure and cohesion to organize their own group in the first place. Men haven't been oppressed for years like women. A man who is beaten up will be too ashamed to admit it. Other men will ostracize this man who is now seen as being weak instead of helping, right? Therefore, a vigilante group never mechanizes, and they show you 0 mechanization to like why this happens in the first place. And I've shown you like 3 mechanization to like why this does not happen, which means I easily take this, right? Okay. Then they go on and show that like women will not report this at all in our case, right? Let me take this out as well and show you why will they will report this abuse and stuff, right? The husband will be ashamed due to this, and even if patriarchal norms exist, this guy definitely does not want to be beaten up again by women, right? Even if like I take massive patriarchal views in your side and say that men just like view themselves to be superior to women, right? This still means that they view it as like a larger shame when they're beaten up by people who they view as inferior to them, which means they do not want this to happen ever again. So they will do whatever the frick it takes to make sure this does not happen again, right? Okay. Now moving on to clashes, right? Okay, there are just like 2 major clashes here. Where are women better off? And the second clash, where is the perception of women better off, right? We take both these clashes cleanly and just take this debate as well, right? Okay, where are women better off? Okay, we have like better self-esteem and more confidence on our side as we see women as being strong and actually like going on for this, right? And okay, as panel, like we've shown to you a clear mechanization on our side as to why women like see themselves as being better or like being strong women and stuff like that, right? So we take the self-esteem clash cleanly. Okay, now tying into the self-esteem clash is also the abuse of women, right? Where is the abuse of women less likely? On our side, men are shamed due to this. Men don't want to be seen as people being beaten up by women. They don't want to be seen as people being like, graffitied on and stuff like that. And because of these direct incentives, they are less likely to abuse women, right? What this less abuse on women leads to is that like women now have like higher self-esteem because like not like abuse is like a massive trauma that exists on women, physical and mental issues, right? Which means like this can like perpetrate mental issues on women, which means like everything they do now will issues linked with the abuse they've faced before, and the abuse they faced before like just like makes everything that they do just like much worse, and like they just like which means that on our side we have like better functioning women, less traumatized women, and women who see them being stronger women who can like actually get more stuff done, right? Before continuing,
okay, so yeah, men don't need any capital to collectivize. They have societal legitimacy already. That's why they're likely to be valued.
When you're talking form their own vigilante groups and stuff like that, it is not reliant on the men to form the vigilante groups. When they form vigilante groups, they are seen as like weak when they're going out against these women, right? So understand, like the main reason they don't form vigilante groups is not because they don't want to be calling out and crying foul about vigilante groups of women, because that makes them look weak and they have fragile egos here. They will not be doing this because admitting that they got beaten up by women is the weakest thing they can do in your paradigm when you consider this patriarchal norms being present, right? Which means they will not do this in the first place. Okay, then moving on to the next class. Where is the perception of women better off? Clearly taken by OP. Let me show you this, right? On OP, we give you mechanisms to like why women are like just like thought about as like being strong women by all of society completely, which means that on OP we get perception of women clash easily here, and understand panel like now men are like much less likely to abuse women because like they think they're strong women and like do not want to be beaten up by mechanism, right? So the perception of women is just this goes cleanly to us. And understand, panel, that Gov has never engaged with why denouncing the feminist movement leads to like all the benefits they're claiming, which I don't even see what the benefits they're claiming are. And like they never engage with like denouncing the feminist movement on their side, right? Okay. With that, I will end my speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Opposition Whip, for that fine speech. With that, we have come to an end to the constructive side of the debate, calling upon the opposition reply speaker to conclude the opposition's speeches. Here you go. Op reply whenever you're ready.
Yes, hello. Just getting my timer. Yes, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, start. Firstly, one major observation about this debate. Note that they are giving you no reason as to why the condition of even a single woman is improving on their end, which means the first and foremost like principle which any feminist organization should be operating on, which is helping out other women, helping them like realize their autonomy, is never fulfilled on their end. The primary thing which any feminist organization wants to do is like benefit women, help them like do what they really want, fulfill their desires. This never happens on their end because the Gulabi Gang and like Las Femicidas or whatever just like dies out completely when governments crack down on them, where they lose legitimacy from this denouncement. And this means lots of women are actually actively losing out on their rights, actively more likely to become abused, actively going to like be targeted by men and not going to get justice. Which means on their end, there are actually no positive benefits. They run a negative case and they lose out because of that. Note that on the clash on where abuse is more likely, they literally have no engagement, right? Because the Gulabi Gang exists, there is a strong principle of deterrence which comes in because men do not want to be the shame which comes from having beaten up by the Gulabi Gang. They do not want the social shame that comes from having graffiti on their walls. They do not want they do not want to be seen as people who are beating up their women, because like even if these places have like abuse which happens to some extent, it largely happens behind closed doors, and this things like problems with your wife, you're not like that good of a husband, stuff like that, which are still looked down upon. When the mechanism of shame still largely exists, there is a lot of deterrence for abuse because of the existence of the Gulabi Gang. If there was no Gulabi Gang, a lot of these places would have domestic abuse. Also, the impacting of domestic abuse is very strong on our end. Domestic abuse prevents you from doing other things, so hurts your self-esteem, like literally hurts you physically, right? You're not able to do like household chores and stuff like that, which means that side which is able to reduce domestic abuse is the side that wins, and we win very clearly because they literally have no mechanism of reducing abuse on their end. Also note that there's this whole clash about like moderate voters. Note that this does not matter at all in this debate, right? This clash is they're completely out of this debate because moderate voters firstly like never hear about the Gulabi Gang in villages. Like city people care about economics, jobs, and like inflation and shit like that. But also moderates just like do not exist in villages. Like democratic reform is never going to help out these people because this is the literal gap which the Gulabi Gang is filling in by existing in these villages. This is what the info slide tells you. There's no reason to take moderate voters into account. But also I have no clue why moderate voters are so into like civility politics, right? A lot of moderates is like people who are violent, like people who are radical. So like this clash is like completely irrelevant, and even if it's irrelevant, I think because we are able to make head, able to create discourse, at least moderate voters talking about what feminism should be like, at least we're able to get some good publicity. But also note that they on the clash about how the perception of women is affected. Not the that at best is going to be like something about violent anarchists or something, but the norm on the perception of women are like not capable of doing their own thing. Women are actually do not have like what do think realize their own desires. So if at some point you see like some this narrative already exists, and if at some point you see like the Gulabi Gang coming up, actually violent, actually strong women, then this creates like two clashing narratives, and that is better than only one dominant narrative because this challenges the societal perception of women. This means that women are far more likely to be treated with respect. Daughters which are born are far more likely to be able to think that yes, they are capable of going ahead and realizing their own dreams. Daughters are far more likely to be able to like think that they should stand up, they should go ahead and unite, they should go ahead and like actually join this Gulabi Gang, stuff like that. And all of this only happens when the Gulabi Gang exists and is not denounced by large feminist organizations. If a large feminist organization denounces the Gulabi Gang, then like they completely disappear off the map, and a lot of these women just like face the brunt of it. Also note, we talked about how the optics of the feminist organization who does this denouncement are hurt very massively, right? Because you have to firstly recognize that this thing exists, which like other people were otherwise not talking about at all, and now you have to control the internal tension which exists because a lot of people like the Gulabi Gang, and now you have to like now you need to sort out this internal backlash within the feminist organization as well. Because the optics of the feminist organization, even the long term, are hurt a lot. But lastly, secondly, note how men are like unable to like do any of the things that they talk about in response. They say that men will like restrict women's movement in response to all these things. I have no clue either that men have the capacity to do doing so. But also, when the Gulabi Gang exists, men are not able to do so because they make them like further targets of the Gulabi Gang in the first place. Where the case just completely falls off, and we win this debate cleanly on all clashes. Thank you.
Thank you, opposition reply, for that fine speech. With that, I'm calling upon government reply to conclude the debate. Here.
Hi, yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Patriarchy in these countries is incredibly internalized. It is enough for women to not even be willing to participate in the discourse that is already happening. I'm the only woman in this entire debate, and this is proof enough of this fact that they do not need their choices to be taken away even further as victims, that they need to be actually told, oh, this is how you're supposed to get justice, this is how you're supposed to deal with this entire situation. We need to give them the opportunity to at least deal with this situation in that manner. Opposition is the one that takes that entirely away. We do not want that to happen. On the biggest clash in this debate, then, which side is actually better in terms of change and safety for women, right? What do we hear from them? Firstly, in terms of this whole idea of checks and balances, that local people support them and they're likely to be rational and inclusive because of the lack of resources that they recognize. But secondly, the biggest idea on deterrence, that shame is incredibly huge, so even other men will be scared, so domestic violence suddenly falls. Huge stance shift from their first two speeches when they suddenly realize, oh, they're probably for metrics to stand, that is the extreme measure that needs to be taken, which is something that their first two speeches did not do. But what are the things that we told you regarding things? Firstly, we told you that support is unlikely to happen because the reason why men are like, if you said that vigilante groups have these checks and balances, they are not going to engage in this violence, right? Even ignoring this contradiction, you have already conceded that you don't have the resources to advance this consistently, which means women are benefit, like even though you tell us that women are benefited at least in some manner, we told you that this is at best ad hoc because you have no way of defending these women over time. So the backlash that happens is much worse. Even if it is not, it is a trade-off that we make because we generate the kind of political and economic capital from these mainstream feminist organizations to things like crisis hotlines, shelters, etc. All of which you take away because men are now going to restrict. Thing maybe then told you that in terms of retaliatory defense. And I agree with the whip here that they're going to make sure that they are not beaten again. And the way to do this is rather, because this is easy to do. It's really, really easy to do because their wives are not going to go talking about domestic violence publicly, right? Also realize women on both sides probably walk around with bruises. People don't really question it. It is that common in these villages, which means that it's not really something that's big enough on shame for women to actually stop doing it because it exists on both sides. The fact that women now have to live on their side with this guilt that their husband has broken bones, that the father of their child is now suffering because of them, the fact that their family has broken because of them, is enough for these women to actually stop talking about this. This came out very clearly in Ganesh's speech, and this was particularly damaging because we also told you how important female fraternities are for these specific people. But let's weigh this really quickly. Firstly, we think that even in some cases where men are scared and they do not do this, we think that they verbally abuse these people and they subject them to this kind of agency, in kind of reduced agency, in a manner that they do not have the economic political capital to move out of these households, right? Which means that the victim card that men get to play because they are the ones who have actually visibly experienced this violence is something that on scale they prevent more amount of women from getting that access, and victim wishes are the ones that get fucked over on their side because they do not get the kind of justice that they want. But lastly, on this idea about look, and this was incredibly contradictory throughout, that we do not need to co-opt, the feminist movement does not need to co-opt and endorse this because it's not going to be as big, but it's big enough for our convenience, for discourse to happen, for women's image to change, for moderates to actually come into the movement as well. We told you firstly that you cannot make a trade-off in this favor of a benefit that you haven't even proved. That's a lose-lose point. But women are seen as more assertive is something that's absolutely untrue because they're seen as people who are outliers, who live outside this patriarchy system and therefore are even more disenfranchised from the movement as a whole. We told you that not every village can have access to these mobilized Gulabi gangs or just these vigilante groups in general, which means it was important for you to bring actual change, which is what proposition has been doing throughout. So proud to stand on Gov.
Thank you, government reply. have come to the end. We have come to the end of the debate. I would like my panelists to also move to the